Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we're looking at being able to solve equations that have the square of a binomial in them. Before we can do that, we need to find ourselves a little pattern. Okay? I've got some very similar problems up here, and I want you to go through and simplify those little expressions, evaluate those little expressions, excuse me. Okay? And keeping in mind two things. One, if the exponent is underneath the square root, you have to do the squaring first and then take the square root, okay? And keeping in mind what a square root is. Remember what you're trying to find when you find a square root. When you take the square root of a number, you're trying to figure out what number squared gets you the number that you put under the square root. So for example, the square root of 16 is 4 because 4 squared is 16. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to try to fill out all of these, A, B, C, D, and E, and even write down an F, what's the pattern. Try to do as many of those as you can, pause, and then come back. Alright, so I'm assuming you've done that. Square root of 7 squared, well, that means we're doing the square root of 49, which is 7. Negative 7 squared, it's the negatives in parentheses, so we do need to square the negative 2. It's negative 7 times negative 7, or 49, which is 7. Okay? Hopefully you can kind of already, in those first two answers, see a little bit of a pattern, but let's move on down and see some other ones. Okay? So, hopefully for this one you got 5. This one you should have gotten 8. This one you should have gotten 8. So what's the pattern here? Well, it's not the same. You don't just get the number that was squared. Like in E's case, what you should be finding is that squaring and square rooting are pretty much opposite processes. Okay, like this is kind of a silly question. The square root of 8 squared, well, that's the opposite process. You're asking the square root of what gets you 8 squared? Well, the answer is 8. But there's a little bit of a catch. For D and C and any of the ones with negatives, we didn't get that number. We got the positive version of that number. Okay, so I mean, I guess that's what I'd say the pattern is. You always got the positive version of the number being squared. You always got that. Now, knowing that that's the pattern, what can we do with that? Now, keep in mind, let's think for a second. We were getting the positive version of those numbers. We just learned about something that always makes numbers positive. So I think the pattern we get is when you square root a number squared, you always get the absolute value of that number. That's what you're getting, the positive version of it, so the absolute value. So the square root of x squared, we have a little definition here. You're going to want to know this definition. When you take the square root of something squared, if it's not a number, if it's got a variable in it, you can't just say it's x. You have to say that it's the absolute value of x because of the way order of operations work. You'd square that number first, it would become positive, and then the square root is a positive number. So even if x was a negative number, we would want the positive version of that number. Okay? So here's how we use this idea to solve equations. Basically, when you're solving an equation, you're trying to get x by itself. Okay, so we need to get rid of two things here, the squared and the minus 3. Okay, and usually, we oftentimes work in reverse order of operations, but that's not really going to work here. We need to get rid of that squared first. Okay, so to get rid of that squared, we're going to take the square root of both sides because those are opposite processes. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of x minus 3 squared is not just x minus 3, because remember, we don't know if that quantity is positive or negative, but we need to assure that it's positive, so we put an absolute value around it. Now, to solve this equation, this is just what we did yesterday, or the lesson before, if you will. We already know how to solve this. There should be two possible answers that get us 5. we should be solving x minus 3 equals 5 and x minus 3 equals negative 5. When we solve both of those, we get x equals 8, and we get x equals negative 2. Let's go back and kind of check our answer. I'm especially curious. I'm going to check that negative 2 answer because the 8 one makes sense to me, but look at the negative 2. Square root of negative 2 minus 3 squared. Well, that's the square root of negative 5 squared, and we know from above that that's going to be 5. Yeah, so we do get 5. That's awesome. The other one is just the square root of 5 squared, which is also 5. So again, for these, you are going to have two solutions, okay? And that's caused by the fact that when you have something squared like this, whether it's negative or positive, it's going to turn it positive, and then we can get ourselves a nice square root there, okay? Oh, and actually, I probably shouldn't have checked with the square root in there, but yeah, it's okay. So, let's try some of these other ones. And let's see what we got. We've got 1, 2, 3 more. I want you guys to try each of those 3. Pause and then come back. Okay, so for this one's pretty straightforward, same as the last one. Take the square root of both sides to get rid of the squared. And you get absolute value of x plus 3 equals 7. Split that up into 2 equations because you'll get 2 very distinct answers here. X plus 3 equals 7. X plus 3 equals negative 7. You get x equals 4 and x equals negative 10. 2 answers that both work. If we go back to our original, we get, when we plug them in, we would get 7 squared is 49 and negative 7 squared is 49. Both those things are correct. Okay, moving on to the next one. The next one we've got a little more work to do, I guess, but it's not really particularly complicated. Okay, so take the square root of both sides. 2x minus 3 equals 3. But again, it's absolute value. When we take the square root of something with a variable in it, we need to put in absolute values. Split that up. And then add 3 to both sides. Oops, that should have been negative 3. We get x equals 3 and x equals 0. And for the last one, just in an effort to keep this relatively short, I'm just going to jump straight to the answers. You should have gotten x equals 6 and x equals negative 12. If you didn't get those answers, make sure to discuss that in your group. Now, we've done some actually fairly easy ones. What if that number wasn't a perfect square? Maybe think about that. Could you still do it the same way? Would it still work? Okay, maybe think about that as, there's possible questions to ask, possible things to discuss with your groups. That's it for this one. Hope you learned a little something. Again, this is just kind of one step added on to what we did the lesson before.